The biggest change we've seen in the technology of whisky making over the past few decades is an understanding of how to use casks to really change the flavour and character of a whisky. And as we've learned more and more about it, we've created new techniques which really dig into flavour and really have created a whole huge range of different types of whisky.
There is a huge variety of casks available today, from bourbon casks to sherry casks, from port casks to an array of different wine casks. Each of these casks impart different flavours to the whisky. Of course, full maturation is different to cask finishing.
We looked at those different techniques and chosen these 5 whiskies to really look at how those different things change the way the whisky tastes. We have everything from very old-fashioned whisky, which have been using techniques that have been going on for decades, potentially centuries, as well as whiskies that have really been tweaking the process to see how we can change things in the future. We have people playing around with different types of cask. We even have whiskies which are really pushing the boundaries and finding quite what you can do with playing around with lots of different types. Balvenie 12-year-old DoubleWood. This is a whisky which pretty much created a category. Back when it was released, it was the first whisky in a core range, and the first regularly available whisky that talk about this side of its production process, that it was matured in one type of cask and then moved to another type of cask to finish. So this is the first easily available sherry finished whisky. The process had been going on for years. This was standard cellar management, and this is the way that you made your whiskies taste great. But nobody really spoke about it before. And as more people wanted to understand how whisky was made and to delve inside that process, Balvenie and a few others started telling people about it, and it went from being just the reason why their whisky was great to being a selling point for the whisky in general. So back when this was released, what's the Balvenie like?
Balvenie hadn't been around for a very long time. It was available in a range called the Classic range, not widely available. And I think, it upset the owners of Balvenie, which are William Grants, who also owned Glenfiddich. They looked at Glenfiddich, which was such a big brand. And I think secretly the family probably liked Balvenie a little bit more in a different way. And, they wanted to do something. They wanted it to, shine. So they did a complete repackaging, and they launched in this livery. Of course, they were already finishing in sherry, as we know, but what they realized was the consumer was hungry for more knowledge, so what they did, they called this product the DoubleWood, and that actually worked superbly well. I think, in one sense they were ahead of the time, because you would expect them to have called the whiskey Balvenie Sherry Finish, but they called it DoubleWood. And a lot of people are, you could say, not big lovers of sherry finished whiskey, but these guys for me are absolute masters of it.
And as we've seen over the last 25 years, since it was launched, it's really just taken on this role as the place to go to for this sherry finish style. We should probably have a taste of it. Yeah, now on the nose, that's classic Balvenie. This is what I now think of when I think about Balvenie.
It's just got the perfect weight and richness, which is very enticing. The honey note comes out straight away. You get cereal characteristics, a bit of red fruit, so things like cherries, strawberries, raspberries, the spice element.
For me, it's almost like sort of like porridgey grain, creamy porridge sort of thing. Drizzle of honey, sprinkle of brown sugar, handful of raisins in there as well. It brings together all those different pieces, but at the same time balancing them. And for me, Balvenie is all about that honey with a little bit of citrus and a bit of cereal, and it's there, and it's not masked by the sherry.
Absolutely superb.
Yeah, and that continues on the palate. That balance, that two sides of the whiskey, but very well integrated, not fighting.
Lovely chocolate, a little bit of coffee.
Yeah, just that little bit of coffee bitterness hiding there at the back to sort of balance things out. Yeah, it's a whiskey that's pretty much created this entire category of finished whiskies. It's a whiskey that's been a big inspiration for other people, as well as folks at Balvenie themselves.
I think, it's become that benchmark of Speyside whiskey now. And I think, I would say it's possibly one of the most consistent everyday whiskies for me. Absolutely superb.
Yeah. Now we move on to Macallan 18-year-old sherry oak. Now, Macallan are well known for producing some of the best, maybe the best sherry cask matured whiskey in Scotland, and the 18-year-old is the flagship of that sherry cask matured range. It's a great whiskey. It's really well known. It's quite hard to get hold of. It's so popular, and Macallan have really been the distillery who has focused on and really pushed this idea of high quality sherry cask whiskey over the decades, and really created this idea of a luxurious sherry cask matured whiskey as one of the pinnacles of Scotch whisky production. So what's your history with Macallan and Macallan 18?
So Macallan was probably my first love when I came into whiskey. It genuinely was what they called the Rolls-Royce of whiskey. As a collector, initially there was a lot to collect. And of course, for me, the intriguing was, why is it so special? And when I tried it, I realized why people fell in love with it. It was just so heavy, it was so rich, it was so luscious. And what I found was people felt that this quality of luxury was about these big, heavy, rich, warm flavors, yeah? And that's why I think Macallan has become so popular. So popular to the extent that they struggle to get casks. So what do? They went to Spain, they set up their own team, they worked with the coopers, they worked with the forests, and basically they made their own wood and asked the coopers to season it for them, those sherry bodegas to season it for them, and now they're full control. Hence the reason, you know, it's such a big brand.
Yeah, and it really is that, you know, from end to end, they're in control of everything. They know what's going in there. And again, when you work with a whiskey like this, Macallan is a big, rich and heavy spirit. It has a load of character, and it's one of those things you really need to balance against your sherry casks. And this is something you and I have discussed on many times about when does Macallan hit its peak, and 18 really is a time where you get that balance of the spirit and the wood coming together to create, you know, glorious harmony. We should probably just test that theory out. So, on the nose, yeah, it's all the things we talked about. Yeah,
it's rich, it's luscious, it's velvety, it's enticing. I would say it's a bit of a winter whiskey to a certain extent, because it's so
richer,
warm and
darker. You know, it was cold out. Yeah, but it has those richer dried fruit notes, those things which are the classic sherry cask notes. You know, those raisins, that fruitcake side of things. Yeah. But it's just a little bit of spice at the back of it as well, just soft spice, nothing too harsh, all very, very well integrated.
Yeah. Mouth coating,
Yeah.
so long, it just resonates through your body. And this is what consumers associate with luxury.
Yeah.
I think that's why they've been so successful.
And really, it has that richness and thickness, but when it comes to the flavours on the palate, it has all those dark fruit cakey notes. It has a tiny hint of sort of like char in there as well, sort of dark chocolate, coffee bitterness, balances out the sweetness, but you don't lose the Macallan spirit. And again, it's one of those things people so often miss, is that it's not only the wood and the spirit that create flavour, it's time. And over time, the spirit will change, the spirit will develop, and there's still that sort of core, sort of orchard fruity nature I often find in Macallan, turned into sort of stewed apples, poached pears, all of that complemented by this rich sherry cask fruit and gentle spice.
As you said, Billy, you know, it's a heavy spirit, you know, made in very small stills, and really for that heavy spirit to work with heavy wood, you really need time. And I find that actually 18-year-old is when it just starts getting to a point where it works beautifully.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Macallan, masters of sherry casks, from beginning to end, they've looked after every single step of this process. And, you know, that's the reason why we have whiskies as good as this.
Absolutely.
And next on our list is Glendronach, 15-year-old, the Revival. Now, when this whiskey was released back in 2009, Glendronach wasn't really a very big name in the whiskey world. It, you know, faded over the years. And Billy Walker, industry veteran, had led a consortium a few years previously to buy Balvenie, and Glendronach was the second distillery in their little portfolio. And Billy looked back at the history of Glendronach, what they were sort of best known for, and they hadn't really been sort of doing very much for a few years, and he invested heavily in sherry casks. They went out and spent millions of pounds on really good sherry, brought the casks back, re-racked casks, filled new casks, and focused Glendronach all on the wonders of sherry maturation. And when they launched the revival, this for me in 2009 is the beginning of the current wave of a love of big sherry cask matured whiskies. So back then, what do you remember about Glendronach and what was going on?
I loved Glendronach. It was predominantly available in bourbon casks and refill casks back in the 80s, but on a very small scale. And then it was released as a sherry expression. At one point, there was 2 products side by side, a bourbon version and a sherry version. And I think that's where Billy took inspiration, because of course, when he bought the distillery, he tried the product, he saw how well it worked in sherry. It's a big spirit again. Secondly, big gap in the market. You know, Macallan was struggling with supply, prices were going up. He saw an opportunity, saw the whiskey worked well, and decided to go down this route and did an absolutely awesome job. What was nice was when he launched in 2009, it took time to establish the brand because it was not very well known. I'd like to say we helped a little bit. In 2015, this won our Whisky of the Year, Whisky Exchange Whisky of the Year. Of course, we started selling bucket loads. Their demand from overseas grew considerably. And I'd like to say to such an extent that a few years later, they had to take the product off the market for a few years because they ran out of stock.
Yeah. Then came back, and it then looked very much more into that sort of range of casks that Billy had filled back in the day, rather than focusing on the Oloroso as the early releases did.
Yeah.
Then brought in that PX sherry, and that's a side of sherry cask maturation that we hadn't really seen so much of until the sort of more recent sort of years of the sherry cask boom. And the new revival combined that sort of richer, stickier PX character with that more traditional Oloroso to create a whiskey which, at first there were many people saying, oh, of course it's not as good as the old one. I think it might be better than the old one. So anyway, shall we have a try? Mm-hmm. Yeah, this for me is like, very much the modern sherry cask whiskey. It has right up front a big turbocharged sherry character, which is a thing that people absolutely love.
I guess in a way it's similar in style to the Macallan, but of course it has different flavors, different backbone. I find this a lot nuttier.
Yeah.
A little drier and a lot nuttier.
For me, it delves into that sort of honey and nut side of things, rather than jumping purely into sort of more fruity backbone. Although there's definitely a lot more, for me, sort of citrusy character, more in that sort of orangey, marmalade-y
Absolutely.
sort of characters.
Dark chocolate.
Yeah. But also from the cask, there's so much cherry in there. Proper real maraschino cherries, not your ridiculous cocktail cherries which are shiny and bright red, but proper dark cocktail cherries.
It's like a cocktail in a glass, isn't it?
Yeah. A couple of drops of this in your Manhattan rather than get some cherries in there, yeah. Mm.
You're right, Billy. For me, the first thing that hits me is that cherry note.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's so prevalent. And then you've got all those lovely warm sherry notes coming through. It's alive. I think that's what's really nice. With sherry, as you say, you get that richness, but there's a freshness in the middle, which just makes it pop, explode.
Yeah. And for me, really big, sort of coming from the back, it's like a spiced chocolate, like dark chocolate with loads of different sort of spices in there. A hint of orange in there as well.
There is.
That sort of classic, sort of, again, new wave dark chocolate, spiced, fruited dark chocolates in there.
Yeah.
As well as having that big sort of cherry note up front. But yeah, then definitely into that honey and nut sort of core as well, which all of this stuff is just packed around. But yeah, big, rich, as I say, very, very modern style, looking at things like Macallan, but building on that learning and creating a style of whiskey which has really helped push sherry casks right up front again and made them the thing which people really, really love today.
I believe it's 46.
It is indeed 46%.
Which means it's non-chill filtered. Hence, actually, texturally, it's a lot more mouth coating. I'm getting a lot more than if it was a lower strength.
But yeah, big, rich, a pioneer, and whiskies that really sort of push Billy Walker and his projects to the fore. Now they've got new curators looking after the distillery.
They do.
And we shall see where they go from here. Our next whiskey is Dalmore King Alexander III. Now, Dalmore is a distillery which is quite famous for its use of big, rich casks, focusing on heavy sherry and long-aged whiskies. But at the same time, master blender Richard Patterson is a man who likes to play around. And King Alexander III was very much his, let's see what we can do. Let's see how we can push this whole using different types of casks to make a whiskey. So we've talked before about DoubleWood, so a couple of different types of casks, maybe a couple of different types of sherry cask. In the King Alexander III, Richard decided to go for 6 different types of cask. So we have bourbon, sherry, port, Madeira, Masala, and French wine. So bringing in all these different types of wood, different types of maturation, different flavours of whiskey, combining them together to create a unified whole. And Richard has focused his career on being one of the top blenders in the biz, and it really is one of those whiskies where I bring together all these disparate flavours to create something quite special. Some hard work, but he's the man for the job. So looking at Dalmore, how have you seen it develop over the years? Have you seen, where did this whiskey come from?
So over the last few decades, Billy, Dalmore's really reinvented itself, from being, again, a small brand which was pretty low price into something which is super premium. Again, predominantly they've gone down the route of sherry maturation and a lot of to do with wine cask maturation. So here what Richard Patterson has done is taken his love of wine and sweet wine and his experimentations into all these and put them all together into one whiskey with 6 different woods. And I actually think it's a very clever whiskey. It's got so many layers of flavor, and I think it's very, very well put together. I think it's really good.
Yeah, and we've seen a load of pretenders since, we've seen numbers going up from 6 on the fronts of bottle labels. And when people now put together whiskies, this broke that sort of rule of, keep it simple. This said, get out there, experiment. You can do more interesting things. And, in the blending world, for blended whiskies, we've seen it quite a lot over the years, but when it comes to malts, it was a thing we hadn't really seen at all.
No.
But anyway, we should probably dive in, have a taste. So,
wow.
Yeah.
First thing for me, it's very syrupy.
Yes.
It's lovely, syrupy, quite balanced. I think from the nose, I would have expected it to have been a lot bigger, especially with so many different woods, big woods, especially big wines. But actually, it's quite elegant.
Yeah, I think it builds around a core of those more traditional casks, around that bourbon and sherry cask. So we have some sort of vanilla-y, fresh fruity notes. We have some of those fruit cakey notes. But then we have these little bursts of other flavours appearing around the outside. Little bits of some sweetness, those sort of Madeira type things, Masala type notes, some fresh grapey notes, a little bit of, strangely for me, cake batter, which I always find with wine casks. But at its core, it still has that lovely balance of fresher and richer sides of the whiskey world. As you say, a lot more nuanced and a lot more elegant than you might expect from, here is a dark coloured whiskey with 6 different casks in it.
I'm getting, again, those cherry notes, plum notes, a little bit of strawberry.
There's quite a lot going on.
There is.
And that fruit really explodes on the palate. All over the place, lots of different types of fruit. Those cherries and those berries you mentioned before. You get a nice load of sort of stewed and baked apples in there as well.
Everything's working in harmony.
Yeah.
I love it. I think what you're saying is absolutely right. It's just little bursts of fruit. Just when you think it's going to settle down, you're going to get another pop.
but all the way through it as well, this nice sort of soft spiciness just sitting in the background.
Beautiful.
You know, just providing a nice sort of base note for everything to build on.
Lovely.
Yeah. Now, complex whiskey, a whiskey that really, at the time of release, was nothing like this out there. It's really pushed the envelope and it's opened the world, you know, for lots of other blenders to come in and try similar things. At the same time, though, this pretty much stands as the benchmark for when you're doing complex blends. This is the whiskey that everybody looks to. And our next whiskey is Glenfarclas 105. Named 105 because that's 105 Old British proof, 60% ABV. It's a big, punchy whiskey focused around Glenfarclas's most well-known characteristic, sherry casks. So it's the first whiskey, as far as I know, which was released as an ongoing cask strength release. So when this is made, they vat together lots of different casks, but they don't add any water in order to get it down to 60% ABV. So big punchy whiskey, no added water. It's all about concentrating the flavours they get from the casks and giving you a big punch. And they use a variety of different casks when they're making it, all focused around sherry, but it's all about creating a complex mix, which, despite the fact it's not very old, allows the casks and the spirit to work together really well and create an iconic spirit. It's been around for a long time as well. 1968 it was released, so this is a whiskey which really has been defining this category for a long time. So you've been working with this for the whole of your professional career, you know, so what do you think of it?
What I love about whiskey from family-owned distilleries is how it changes and evolves. And that's mainly because of stock profile. They bottle what they have. So if you go back to some of the earlier 105s, as you said, this was launched in 68. Now what's really nice to see in some of the earlier bottlings is that some of them are actually very light, some of them are really dark. And that really depended on what stock profile they had at the time, which I love. And over time, I've seen this product change a little. Sometimes it has been, even in recent years, has been darker, and sometimes it's been lighter. I actually like the current format of Glenfarclas 105, which is a balance of first fill and second fill. I would say more second fill. So that the sherry is juicier, it's fruitier, it's less in your face, you know, with those dark, heavy notes. It's a big, oily whiskey that even though it's so strong in alcohol, it handles the strength really well. Yeah. It can absorb the strength and you've got enough flavor, fruit there to show it off. I think an interesting point is not all distilleries could do this. To bottle a whiskey at 60% at this age, I think it would be too spirity. I think the alcohol would be just too hot, whereas this is just perfect.
Yeah, and it's all about that balance, and that's really, you know, when it comes to talking about casks, it's all about balance, how you use them. If you get some nice big punchy spirit, you stick it in a really, really fresh cask, you're going to rip out all the flavour of the cask, but you want the whiskey to develop as well. So those refill casks really allow that balancing side where it's not just about the cask. And the current iteration of 105, as you say, it's changed over the years. As a whiskey that's been around as long as this will have done, it really is though all about the casks they have and how they can use casks to make great whiskey.
It's interesting that we're all obsessed with cask strength whiskey, single cask strength whiskies. And sometimes, we're looking and we can't find the right thing. We actually forget about this and realize, I know this is a standard core expression, but it actually hits that spot and fills that gap, between going from your standard malts into your single cask strengths. This for me is that perfect product.
Yeah. Now you should probably have a bit of a taste of it. So.
Fresh, youthful.
Yeah, it's not a whiskey which is hiding from that fact that it is quite youthful. It's got some of those sort of fresher notes in there still. It hasn't sort of started picking up those sort of darker oxidized notes you would get from an older whiskey. It is fresh, it is zingy, but it's still got a big whack of sherry in there.
I get a lovely eau de vie note, but not immature spirit. As I said, it's a big spirit, it can handle it.
Now when you get these whiskies, which you smell them, you can smell the still almost in it still. That's not really what you want. You want those edges to be rounded off. You want some of that fieriness to calm down. You want some of the wood and the whiskey to integrate, and some of those spirit characters that you get with longer aging to start developing. And just on the nose, you have some fruit, which is starting to sort of like become juicier, as well as the fruit from the cask as well.
I get a lot of lemon.
Some sharp apple notes in there as well.
A lot of fresh fruit, green apple, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's try it.
Yeah. It's quite intense on the palate as well.
It's big.
Yeah.
It knows, it tells you I'm here.
Yeah.
It wakes you up, but it's in balance, which I like.
It's whenever I teach people about whiskey, I use Glenfarclas as my example of a short still that produces this rich, heavy, oily style of spirit that carries on into the texture in the glass as well.
Yeah.
It's rich on the palate. But along with that appley side of things, it also has this soft spice, those beginnings of those sort of, not quite fruitcake yet,
Yeah.
but you know, a little bit of spiced fruit loaf or something like that. So those richer, darker flavours are just starting to inch in around the sides.
It's very Moorish, actually.
Oh, yeah.
It's very Moorish. It's really palate coating, and you know it's a beast.
Yeah.
It's a youthful beast.
Yeah, and now this is a whiskey which really shows off what you can do with some great casks, some great spirit, and understanding how your spirit works with the casks. Yeah. And this is the thing that we've had so much over the past few decades with wood, is that distilleries have learned so much about how to meld wood and spirit and how to manage it and create consistently great whiskies.